I have a secret. It is that I've always had the feeling I wish I was born earlier. And for the longest time, I didn't really know why I felt this way. Could it just be the Y2K trend got to me? Or the stories I hear from my parents growing up in the golden era during the 80s? Or is it just because I really like listening to city pop? This feeling never left me, and it still hasn't. But recently, I think I finally found the reason to why I might have been feeling this way for the longest time. A while ago, I stumbled upon the article A Time We Never Knew by Freya India, written in 2024. In it, they talk about the word animoya, meaning nostalgia for a time or place that one has never known. And that was when I finally found the word that perfectly describes what I've been feeling for the past few years. I was born in the early 2000s, so yes, I was alive during the Y2K era, but I was still a very small child, and memories of that time were still really blurry to me. Yet, why do I crave going back to a time which I barely remember? Heck, why do I even get nostalgia sometimes from consuming media that was way before the time I was born? Hi everyone, my name is Veda, aka Saku, here on the internet, and if you've been following me for a while, you probably know that last year I decided to switch back for a flip phone for half a year. Well, it was more of a half flip phone, half a smartphone. And I realized I said the word half so many times in the previous sentence. But anyways, earlier this year I made a video explaining to why I decided to switch back. And the video surprisingly became one of my top viewed videos in recent years. And there were many people too commenting in the video that they also related to this sentiment, looking into switching back to older technologies. Other than that, there were also comments from millennials reminiscing on the time they used flip phones in the past. But the thing that struck me the most is that a lot of Gen Z, especially the younger side, commenting that they wish that they could have experienced the flip phone life that they never got to experience, which is one of the reasons why I decided to switch back in the first place. This certainly isn't a one-time case though, people being fascinated about the past. So without further ado, in this video, let's explore reasons to why we, especially Gen Z, feel nostalgia to a time that we never knew. Thanks to the internet, media from many years ago were able to make its rounds through the current youth again. One very famous example of this being Japanese city pop. Originally released in 1985, Plastic Love by Maria Takeuchi was able to get its second life in the 2010s, as a whole 30 plus years later, as an 8-minute version of the song went viral on YouTube. By 2019, the song had 22 million views, and then a whopping 55 million in 2022, right before the song got copyright striked. This phenomenon led to an international resurgence of interest for city pop, introducing many young fans to this genre, including myself. I remember also being recommended this video by YouTube at that time, and I gotta say, the YouTube algorithm really knew what they were doing back then. Anyways, this is probably the first time that many youths felt reconstructive nostalgia for the first time. Comments like, "Ah yes, I'm so nostalgic of the good old days of living in a place I never lived in a time that I was never alive, in a language I do not know," and "I am feeling very nostalgic for a person who isn't even from the 80s or Japanese," and so forth, filling the comment section. However, this isn't the only case in which Gen Z was nostalgic for a time they never knew. Fast forward 20 years to the 2000s, and people are equally as nostalgic for that era as well. Though by the 2000s, most Gen Z would have existed, but I feel like most of us were so young that we really wouldn't remember much about the 2000s, only little fragments of memory here and there. Yet, right now, the popularity of Y2K is at an all-time high. From plastic beads aesthetics, playing to our 3DSs again, to buying digicams, a lot of Gen Z are making ways back to these items from the past. I know they can't take all the credit for this, but I think a big part in why Y2K became trendy again, especially in the East, is because of the K-pop girl group NewJeans, which debuted in 2022. When the group blew up, so did its aesthetics, from their music videos, from using camcorders, colorful accessories, and even using 2000s IP like the Powerpuff Girls. Though this new era of Y2K isn't completely faithful to the 2000s, because nobody misses the worst parts of that time, like how GPS was barely a thing back then and you'd have to carry a physical map, or how computers were much slower back then, this trend was more of a modified version. Some people call this new Y2K era, quote, retrofuturism or modern Y2K. And heck, some people even take it a step further and create the genre Y3K, mixing 2000 styles with cyberpunk, quote, the future evolution of the Y2K aesthetic. So the best way to describe the current Y2K trend is mixing the best parts about the 2000s and even the late 90s and combining it together in a modern way. When asked why is Gen Z so into Y2K aesthetic and fashion, people on Reddit said, "For me, it's more of a fuzzy nostalgia and unlocking of memories. Seeing pop culture stuff back then with more of an adult perspective versus the time when I didn't give it much thought because I was so young." And, quote, "I do associate the early 2000s aesthetic with my childhood, but I also see it in a way that I didn't as a little kid, almost like I'm creating new memories of the early 2000s. Basically, the idea of reconstructing nostalgia again. So we talked about the 80s and the 2000s so fast, so let's just talk about the in-between too, the 90s. The third example I'd like to give is during the pandemic, there was a trend of 90s high school videos. Of course, there were people from older generations nostalgic about the good old days, but majority of the comments were actually Gen Z, aching for a world that they never got to experience. In the video, people were talking to each other, people were present in the moment. Nobody was on their phones, something that Gen Z never really got to experience. A Gen Z commenter wrote, quote, "My high school experience was nothing like this. I remember short bursts of people living in the moment, but everything, in all caps, revolved around our phones, Snapchat/Instagram status. It almost made me angry because I've never had a simple, straightforward interaction as shown in this video. Even looking at people in the background, they are completely present and not buried on their phones. Everyone seemed a lot more social. I'm jealous of millennials/Gen X. Y'all experienced a golden time to be young and free." So from these three examples, we can see that Gen Z is not only nostalgic from the era that we were born in, which is mainly the 2000s, but also the 90s and the 80s, which are times that most of us did not exist in yet. But that leads us to the question, what is nostalgia in the first place? Nostalgia, defined by Merriam-Webster, is a wistful or excessively sentimental yearning for a return to or of some past period or irrecoverable condition. The term nostalgia first emerged around the 17th century as the Swiss doctor Johannes Hofer to describe the anxieties displayed in soldiers fighting away from home. It was described as more of a medical condition, a form of melancholy and a form of sickness. According to the Chinese University of Hong Kong anthropology professor Xiling Cheng, nostalgia or nostalgic trends typically happen when people are dissatisfied with the current era or time that they live in. And as a response, they would turn to things of the past, no matter it be consuming medias or buying items, as a way of finding comfort and stability. A prime example of this is the resurgence of 70s and 80s music during the pandemic, as artists like Toto, ELO, and Queen joined the top 200 list on Spotify Music once again, which they never have been on the list prior to the pandemic. Dr. Timothy Young's research for the COVID economics showed that the nostalgia effect peaked roughly 60 days after lockdown policies were introduced in each country. As Young said, quote, "Negative emotions are various, but they are similar in one dimension, which is it hurts and leads people to react. To amend, to try to counter the negative feelings, one possible way to recover or to generate positive utility is to seek nostalgia that reminds people of the good old days." In sociologist Fred Davis's work, Yearning for Yesterday, he states that the feeling of nostalgia only gets stronger in a time in which society is rapidly changing. And in an era which things are moving at a increasingly rapid pace, Gen Z and the generations that come after us start to feel a sense of nostalgia stronger than ever before. And this is why, especially more in recent decades, that there seems to be a trend of nostalgia every 10 years. Of course, most generations do get nostalgia, it's not just Gen Z. But the difference is that most generations feel a sense of nostalgia towards their own youth. But for Gen Z, along with our childhood nostalgia, we also get nostalgia for times that we never knew. So, what is the source of anxieties and dissatisfaction that Gen Z is dealing with to be so nostalgic to the point we reminisce over worlds that we never even existed in? Recently, my friend recommended me the book The Anxious Generation by Dr. Jonathan Haidt, which I've yet to finish reading, but I listened to one of his podcasts recently in which he talks about all the negative effects that Gen Z had to deal with growing up with technology. And let's just say the very vulnerable period in which we are rewiring our brains, aka puberty, and social media do not go well together. Haidt says, during this conversion in which the brain is converting from child to adult form, huge neurons are removed, complex circuits that are useful, things we often do as a child get locked in, and doing these activities become more quick and efficient. As the first generation to truly grow up with the internet, to have this incredible, vulnerable, and sensitive period of our lives to be exposed to random strangers, often weirdos on the internet, decided by the algorithm due to probably their extremity, made it a very, quote, dysfunctional puberty, according to Haidt.
Gen Z didn't have that luxury. As soon as their brain started rewiring, they were thrust into the virtual world with crazy, crazy stuff coming at them.
I've actually made another video about like 2 or 3 weeks ago about a similar topic on how Gen Z refuses to grow up, which if you're interested, I'll link in the description. But basically in that video, I talk about the many reasons why Gen Z is still obsessed with toys and how society doesn't really allow us to grow up the same way that our parents did in the past. However, I don't think we're nostalgic just because of those reasons. Of course, the 90s, the 80s, the 70s is not all bliss as well, because no era really is. But the world we inhabit now, with social media and rapidly changing technology, is just so different. Everything we have now is replaced by the digital world, a world in which people aren't as amused in things anymore, a world filled with instant gratification, and a world, despite being constantly connected, seems to be more solitary than ever. Because of this, the world from the past, the world in which social media didn't really exist yet, sounds so appealing and fascinating to a lot of Gen Z. Things back then seem to be a lot more soulful and made with heart compared to a lot of things now that seem so corporate and soulless and less colorful. To quote Shreya India, the article that I referenced from the very beginning of this video, "But God, that loss, that feeling. I'm grieving something I never knew. I'm grieving that giddy excitement over waiting for and playing a new vinyl for the first time, when now we instantly stream songs on YouTube, use Spotify with no waiting, and skip impatiently through new albums. I'm grieving the anticipation of going to the movies when all I've ever known is on Netflix on demand and spoilers, and struggling to sit through an entire film. I'm grieving simple joys, reading a magazine, playing a board game, hitting a swing ball for hours, where now even split-screen TikToks where 2 videos played at the same time don't satisfy our insatiable, miserable need to be entertained." End quote. But I never knew it. Maybe briefly as a child, but most of us in Gen Z were given phones and tablets so early that we barely remember life before them. Dealing with my fair share of animoia, I always indulge myself in older music, movies, and animations. I think about how people, particular older generations, talk about how simple life used to be back then and how everything is worse now and stuff like that. And I too start mourning for times that they talk about which I never got to experience. However, with this always on my mind, I also made a realization. As long as we are dissatisfied from the present, the past would always sound more appealing, and therefore will always be nostalgic, because thinking about those things will always be comfort to us. Even though COVID-19 was a horrible time for a lot of people, the most isolating that we've all been in a time full of absolute uncertainty, now in 2025, people start to feel nostalgic during that 2020 lockdown era, because looking back, everything already happened and we don't feel uncertainty towards it anymore. And after listening to many happiness and psychology podcasts while I draw, I also learned recently that there's a scientific reason to why we feel this way. Studies on autobiographical memory by the American Psychological Association have found that human memory is biased towards happiness, and that pleasant emotions seem to fade out much slower than unpleasant emotions. Dr. W. Richard Walker, when talking about his study, said, "This implies that there is a tendency to deaden the emotional impact of negative effects relative to the impact of positive events." And quote, "Such deadening occurred bidirectly because people are motivated to view their life events in a relatively positive light." So it's no wonder why we feel nostalgia, and most of the time we will look back on our old memories so fondly. And in an era in which the present seems to be a lot worse, these feelings become much stronger than ever. But what I also realized after spending many months thinking about this, well, of course I already knew, but just to say it again, no matter how hard we try, no matter how nostalgic we may feel, you cannot, full stop, return to the past unless someone builds a time machine in like 100 years. Jokes aside though, as time passes, the moment we live in right now will become the past. And then somehow in the future, even though right now we might not be satisfied with the present, in the future we'll look back on this present really fondly through those nostalgic rose-tinted glasses. Sure, the 90s and the 80s, they all sound cool, but the matter of the fact is that I never physically was able to experience those eras, and what I think about those eras are reconstructive nostalgia and things I thought it would be, but it would not actually be that. So instead of always feeling like, oh, I wish I lived in the past, we should embrace the present more. I know it sounds so cheesy, but at least we can be grateful now that we have the technology and such easy access to consume a lot of these older medias. A great metaphor I heard recently is by Hank Green, one of the Vlog brothers, and he compares the internet to food. The internet is basically how we get information. Information can be good. It allows us to learn more and become more knowledgeable. Yet too much of information is not very healthy. Hearing that recently really made me mind blown because I never really thought of social media or the internet in that way before. And with that, thank you all so much for watching this week's video. If you want to check out my other video relating to this topic about how Gen Z refuses to grow up, I'll link that in the description below. So yeah, I've been uploading weekly talking about topics that I'm very passionate about, from art, animation, to culture and psychology. And I'm also an animator, so I make the occasional videos about my journey as an artist and vlog once in a while too. So if you're interested, please consider subscribing to the channel and liking this video. Your support to this channel would mean a lot to me. As always, I'd love to hear your thoughts about this topic in the comments down below, and I'll see you next time. Bye bye!